a compressed way. It shows in a compressed way what's going on. You know, at every altitude, it talks about the weather, it talks about the species, it talks about the people living there, and so forth. Okay, so sorry. Can you do it with this? It's this one, right? Okay, so so the cover is very meaningful because it's the first known drawing of a transect, and I think you'll have a very accurate idea as you see more of the drawings, and you'll understand the concept and the usefulness. By the way, the co-author is Brian Falk, who couldn't be here today, and we run the non-for-profit Center of Applied Transect Studies, which is about 15 years old, and it's a not-for-profit dedicated to studying aspects, usually urbanistic ones, that have to do with the transect. So this is his lecture. Now, the one way to think about the transect is it's a cut through nature. And here at the top, well, let's say at the bottom, there's a famous drawing by Ian McHarg, and it shows a shoreline with where the water is, the first dune line, the second dune line, etc. And look at how it's labeled: beach, foredune, primary dune, swale, secondary dune, stable, back dune, etc. And it shows you the species that lives in each one. And the idea of a transect is a cut through nature that shows how each part of a sequence through nature is actually symbiotic, how the things that live in each habitat actually relate to each other. Now, this is a relatively new idea. It used to be that we thought that you could take anything anywhere as long as it didn't die. You could take, for example, you could bring melaleucas from Australia and plant them in the Everglades, or you could take bamboo from here and take it there. And now we have a much more sophisticated understanding that if things are not symbiotic, they cause trouble. You know, those fish that are now in the Great Lakes that are invasive species cause no end of the trouble. You know, those snakes that we have in the Everglades, which are terrific elsewhere, are predator species that are devastating in our Everglades. So we understand this symbiotic relationship of things. And at the top is a diagram by DPZ that shows how each part of a beach, let's say, has its habitat. This is also, now thanks to some insight on our part, we found that it could be extended into cities. This is a photograph of Chicago, and you can see that it's actually the Midwest land at the base. At the bottom of the drawing is, some of it is wilderness, and then you see low density suburbia, higher density general areas, you see the neighborhoods, and finally you see the core. And this also is a transect. And not only because it has different degrees of nature, but because it has different intensities of human habitation. And by intensity, I mean, it's all mixed use. It's not like conventional zoning, it's all mixed use, but what increases is the intensity. And for example, if you think of dress, the kind of dress that you might find, then you might use, let's say, in the woods, down at the bottom of the picture. If you go and try to go to a nightclub or a restaurant in downtown Chicago, you might look like an idiot. Do you see what I'm saying? Everything is appropriate to its place. It's not that, you know, it's not that a bathing suit is wrong when it's on, it's not wrong when it's on the beach, but if you try to wear a bathing suit in downtown Coral Gables, you might be arrested. And yet it's the same person, same dress. It's just in the wrong place. And what the transect does, what we did, is to actually correlate the urban and the rural together, the natural and the man-made. And now, other people have intuited it very easily. For example, this is a drawing from, this may be one, I don't know whether this is by Dr. Zeus, but you can see that as part of one of his little poems, he actually shows a transect, okay? And it says, houses of all shapes and styles from town to town for miles and miles. And it's very clearly that there's a transect there. And this is, it's so easy to understand that here we have on the right is Lila, which is one of my partners, Marina Khoury's beautiful daughter. Too bad Cheryl Jacobs is covering up her face. But she actually heard the talk and without looking at anything drew a transect. You see, not bad at all. So she got it, the little kid got it. Okay, now in Miami Beach, it's quite interesting to see. Those of you who know Española Way will know that at the western end there are houses, and then there are low apartment buildings, and then there are mixed-use buildings as you move east. And as you move east, it gets much more mixed use and much more dense. That is a mini transect that occurs there. And I think some years ago, you may remember that Española Way was voted the most important street in South Florida. And those of us who voted for us, because we knew very well that it was a transect, you know. And just look at it, just go out and check out what a transect it is to go from west to east in Española Way. It's an urban transect. And then diagrams began to emerge. You can see the one at the bottom. By the way, many of these are by different firms, different architectural firms that I'm not going to remember who did what, but you can see the transect. And by the way, here's an interesting detail, which is actually it doesn't always have to be like a fried egg in which it grows slowly. You can have radical juxtapositions. Like, for example, you can have a high rise next to a shore. And that is, obviously, those are the extreme differences of transect zones, but you can put them in juxtaposition. So there are all sorts of ways to play with the transect. This is the standard issue diagram. We took it, and you can see very easy, it's very easy to understand. And we, for convenience sake, we labeled it T1, which is natural, T2, which is rural, T3, which is suburban, not suburban, suburban. T4 is general urban, which is that mixed area we mostly love that has townhouses and houses, etc. Then there's the urban center, which are the main streets, and then there's urban cores. Now, not every city has an urban core, and sometimes the urban center is very small, but almost every human habitation in whatever culture has some form of transect like this. And you can begin to actually put a lot of things in order. For example, trees. How do you select trees? Here is, this is from the smart code, and you can see the tree shapes go from urban to rural on the right. You can see how the frontages, the one in the middle, is a plan that shows the relationship of 2 lanes of moving traffic and buildings. And you can see how they can go from urban to rural. Urban being at the bottom, rural to the south. And then there's even the drawing on the left shows different degrees of urbanity, transect based, from the single story with the porch to the mixed use building with the flat roof on the right, you see. And here you see the power that this has to put building types, landscape types, street types, you know, all these things in useful order. And just to prove it, once I was lecturing out in Sarasota, and there were a bunch of people in the room, and I said, take off your shoes, and let's put them in the order of a transect from urban to rural. This is no kidding. I'm sorry, we didn't take the shoes off the people. This was somebody's house, and we pulled them out of the closet. Okay, this is out of his closet, and you could see the most rural ones on the left, obviously, and then the most urban ones, the shiny ones on the right. And that took a minute and a half to be able to discern very quickly the urban, the rural. Now, look how sophisticated this can get. On the left are fences photographed within 3 blocks in Williamsburg, Virginia. And you can see at the top left how the rural one, which is all about cattle, or the next one at the upper right, which is split logs, and then split logs as a fence. And then you see it also becomes more and more urban. Finally, you get turned wood, and finally brick, and then brick and iron. So here you have 8 fences. 8 fences. Like, how do you choose? What do you do? Is it like a decorator? Is it just stylistic? Is it just personal preference? Or do you articulate your selection to reinforce the city, to add character to the city that you are that you are living in. Or, if you're building a particular fence, don't build a wrought iron fence in the country because they're going to think you're a vulgar Texan. Okay, and also don't do a split rail fence in a parking lot because they think it's kitsch. It's just kitsch. I've seen terrible parking lots trying to ingratiate themselves with me by having a split rail fence and a couple of rocks. And I think, this is ridiculous. But out in the country, it's not ridiculous. So everything, as a planner and as an architect, you don't become somebody that banishes things. You become somebody that allocates things. You say, yes, you see these 8 fences? Well, yes, they're all possible. I'm not going to say, well, the upper one is ridiculous or the lower one is ridiculous. No, they're all possible as long as they are in their context, in their symbiotic environment. And it's very easy to take photographs of cities. Aerial photography is so cheap now. And just select a piece and you can see very easily. If you know how to read it, it doesn't take a lot of skill to read this stuff, and you can see the urban to rural transect very, very quickly. Now, by the way, you can also do you can also do them across cities. You see on the right, those are different cities. It isn't just a single stripe. So you can compare things as well. Very interesting to see. It's a way of comparing urban fabrics. The origins, this is a famous Chinese scroll in the Taiwan Museum. And you say, well, this is a beautiful scroll, but when you look at it from the upper left to the lower right, it's actually a transect from countryside to the center of the village, with all the elements changing, all the elements evolving and being appropriate to the place. And it's so interesting to actually realize that in a pre-literate society, that these scrolls were actually instructive. This is a way of instructing people how to deal with landscape and how to deal with their cities. In the lower one, this is one of the 2 frescoes in Assisi, and it shows this one's called Good Government and Bad Government. Good government is what you're seeing, this one, and it's a transect. And you can see the city on the left, and you can see the wall, and then the countryside on the right. And it's a very hard edge between city and countryside. And this is called good government. Bad government actually has a lot of sprawl. It looks like an American version. The city is decrepit and falling apart with lots of empty lots. And there's a lot of suburban sprawl on the right. It's so funny that 5 centuries ago, there was good government and bad government. And what they were illustrating is what problem we have now, which is abandoned downtowns and suburban sprawl. So you can see the transect is an ancient way of looking at the world with an ethical dimension, okay? There's implied in this, there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And such is the imperative that we need also for cities, not just for environmentalism. I think we understand that we present environmentalism as habitat, symbiotic habitat, and that we ipso facto is ethically mandatory. We don't move the butterfly, we don't move the turtle. This is where it belongs. You don't put it in a truck just because you want to build a shopping center and move it out. You leave it there. And but we don't have the same kind of theory that makes urbanism ethically binding, that you say, no, that's the wrong building. You shouldn't be building a building that tall here. It's not symbiotic, you see? And that goes for everything, parking, landscaping, etc. It's a very useful tool for urbanism. Now, the first time it was used for urbanism was at the right. The first time humans were inserted into a transect, and this is who was the Englishman? I wish I had my captions here. Anyway, famous guy. I'm sorry, it's too late in the day. And this is the first guy that drew a transect. It was called the Valley Section, and it's a watershed from the high rise, from the high points of the mountains to the river at the bottom or the bay. And it shows you what the human activity is in each of them, from the miner to one to the woodman, etc. So he brings in humans. And then this is This is the other Scotsman up in the guy sorry, I don't remember the name. I mean, if I calm down, I would know the name. But these are his labels of, it's an early photographic transect that shows both very early, both at the turn of the century, of the 1900s, showing species and humans involved. These are the famous ones by Ian McHarg, which I showed earlier. Famous drawings from the 1960s. And then there's a history to it. This is by Raymond Unwin on the left that shows the town center, and then shows, as you go back, shows the landscape as it gets less dense. And this is, I have to get my, I'm sorry, I have to get my crib sheet. This is an interesting guide, it's a Canadian planner showing how urbanism goes from blocks at the bottom in the dense area, and gradually the density decreases, and the streets become more picturesque as they engage the landscape. You know, usually the topography gets more intense towards the edges. So here he is showing, without too many illustrations, you know, there's very little text that accompanies these early drawings because it was so evident to people what it meant. It's only we, with our stupid suburban zoning categories, that need to have a lot of text to explain what the hell am I looking at. You know, the transect was such a natural thing in the early 20th century that the illustration was enough to be understood. This is one of the funny things that began to occur the early days of the transect. This is an English one. Rural situation, Arcadia, boulevard planning, unsatisfactory suburbia, urban situation, large town and city center. Couldn't be more crude. This is 1970 in England. And then on the left, on the bottom one, is the same thing illustrated by photographs. There are different ways to draw the transect, and it had its history. It evolved over time, and that is covered in the book. And these are illustrations by different people over time. They're all different. The one on the left is by Leon Creer from the 1970s. You can see urban to rural, you know, top to bottom. I guess the convention is you put the urban at the bottom and the rural on top, the gradual thing. These are very comprehensive illustrations. Look at the one on the right. So utterly American, you know, so clear. Everything about it, how the trees work, the building types, the type of streets and so forth. And he goes on and on. These are all by different hands and in different parts of the world, different parts of cities. And so what's exciting about the transect is that once we put it out there, over the last 15 years, it was immediately understood by planners and architects, and it became a collective endeavor. And so for this book, we collected literally 50 or 60 of these drawings, and we show many of them in the book. They're gorgeous. You can see different climate conditions. You can see different hands, you know, thinking different things. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to see so many architects cooperating in a way that's very rare in the profession. Always urban at the bottom, rural above. And these are typological illustrations of what is meant by every T-zone. By this time, the 6 T-zones had become conventional. And so these are normally labeled T1, T2, T3, and so forth, like I showed you. It's also, you're able to document things. For example, you take a photograph, like I showed you earlier. Just take a photograph of a city. And here we have Pienza, Munich, Portland, Miami, etc. And you can see, you can very quickly say, this is T6, T5, T4, T3, and T1. And then you go in and you can further analyze it. And you can also do it across the way. This is so interesting because, for example, these are different cities. The bottom one is Baltimore, Key West, New Orleans, Omaha, and San Francisco on top, okay? And you can see the T6, which is the urban core, T5, which is the main street, T4, which is the general higgledy-piggledy mixed area, and then T3, which is the suburban area. And not only can you see each of these relative within each city, but then you can use them across the cities. You can go to all the cities and see, hey, what's your T3 like, and compare it. What's your T4 like? So there's a kind of scientific basis for analyzing cities in something more than just, hey, this is the density. You know, there's so much crude comparison these days in the discourse of urbanism, in which they say, oh, well, this city's denser than that city. I mean, what does that mean? It means nothing, absolutely nothing. They don't even know whether it's net or gross, but this really does give you a basis of comparison, especially now with cheap aerial photography. And then here's a transect, which is good. This is the good city on the left, the city of good government on the left. And on the right, it's really funny, suburban sprawl, you see? And so it's not T, it's not a transect zone, it's a standard zone. You see S6, S5, S4. And so yes, there are these two kinds of cities in America. The one on the left, which is the city of good government, and which is the one we code, the one the new urbanists aspire to, at least to make life easier for it to implement. And then there's the mess, which is actually legal, which is our suburban sprawl, which is causing most of our ecological and social problems. And so this is a comparison. Now, these are fascinating. You can just photograph it. At the bottom is a series of photographs taken from a single vantage point of Ronda in Spain. I stood in one place and I photographed from left to right, and there was a perfect transect. And then this is one by Sandy Sorleen of a town, and she was documenting the 3 transect zones with its particular local character. This is another set by Sandy Sorleen. You can see, so it's a specific town. If you're going to code this town, the first thing you do is an analysis that actually extracts excellent examples of each transect zone. One of the things about the transect, there's many terms in urbanism. Here you have the urban village, the quartier of Leon Creer, transit-oriented development, traditional neighborhood development, livable neighborhoods. You see it, the cell, the city, the town, the village, the hamlet. You can see all the proprietary terminology at the bottom, but actually they're all after the same thing, which is the good city, the city of good government. At least these are. And by using the transect on top and allocating what they cover in their conceptualization, you can actually see very clearly how they correlate. And so all these things that seem to be different concepts can be proven easily to be really one concept, aspiring to a single ideal condition, which is the proper transect. And this is one for regional planning that shows the relationship of towns, villages, rural communities, and landscape. This is based, like all of these transects, they're based on specific places. Everything is local in the calibration of these things. This is a regional plan. Now notice the colors that we use to show transect are not the colors of suburbia. The colors of suburban planning are red, orange, yellow, right? Which means commercial, residential, and light residential. It's confusing if you use the same colors. And in any case, we are not talking about single-use zoning. All of the aspects of the transect, every transect zone is mixed use. It's mixed use. It just happens to be of different intensity. Not happens to be, it's intentionally of different intensities. Like for example, you can have a convention hotel at T6. You can have just a regular 400-room hotel in T5. And then you can have a motel in T3, and you can have a bed and breakfast in T2, for example. They're all lodging. Same zoning category in terms of function, but different intensities. And that's how the new transect-based codes, called the SMART code, that's how they work. These are other drawings by people that show how diagrams can actually be illustrated different with greater or lesser degrees of specificity. The SMART code, of course, pulls it all together and makes it it's a model code that provides the format for legislating a transect-based outcome. And in it, there are plenty of very simple diagrams that begin at the regional level, and then it moves on. This is the one that explains the transect. By the way, these are 3 different ways to explain the transect. Each T zone, there's a narrative one on the left, and then there's a couple of technical ones on the right. Sometimes both are necessary at different times. And then you can see how the frontages are done in plan and section. The frontage is how the building meets the wall. Now notice that frontages actually can correspond to 2 or 3 transect zones. The SMART code, like most cities, is what's called a parametric code. There's not a single thing that happens in each category, in each zoning category. There isn't a single thing. It overlaps with the next thing. Okay, so you can see how one of these you can see how they overlap. They occur in several. So there's no hard edges between the transect zones the way that there are in conventional zoning. What happened here? Oh, is that it? What happened? Is that it? It's the next slide. Okay. Now this is a very easy way to write a code. You identify an ideal condition. In this case, it's T3 suburban for a part of, geez, I don't know what city. Oh, Gentilly in New Orleans. And you basically take a quadrat and a dissect. And I don't have time to go into this, but these are two environmental analytical systems. When you give an environmentalist a site to analyze, they will do a quadrat and they'll do a dissect. And they will extract what they see there. The microclimate, they will extract the species, the number of species per square foot. They will actually talk about the minerals, the water, the hydrology, et cetera. And then that becomes, the preservation of that becomes ethically binding. You can do the same thing very, very simply in a city when you're looking for the local DNA in order to write a code that's local. These are illustrations of how you would do a code, such a code. You identify this specific location of a particularly good example of each transect zone that you see on the left. You have a public process and say, we need to find a T5, where's the best T5 you have, where's the best T4? And then you take it, you do a quadrat and a dissect, you extract the material and you insert it into a code. You basically take the material and say, these are the setbacks, this is the density, this is the way the trees are, this is what the fences are like. So it's very easy to do a code, and you can demonstrate to the people what it is they're going to get. Because they say, well, what does T3 mean? What does a 25-foot setback mean? What does 3 stories mean? You say, well, let's go out and look at it. And of course, you've already selected an ideal condition that they're going to like, and they'll say, oh, if that's what you're talking about, I understand it. So this is very inexpensive way to do planning, and it's very assured because people can kick the tires. They can go out and see what's going on. Now, other specialties can be integrated. This is one, by the way, these are all by different people. This is one that shows in the transect zones, both the density, the building types, and the kind of retail that works. This is a retail diagram that shows which kind of store and how big it is that goes anywhere. That's by Seth Harry. And then there are other ways. The hydrology is on the left. There are different things. This one is this is a poverty transect, the kind of poverty that you find in different transect zones on the right. And then this one is an ecosystem analysis on the left. Let's see what this one says on the right. It's for Phoenix, and it probably has to do with TODs. And on, okay? You can see by the different graphics that the transect is now immanent with an A. It's everywhere. People think in terms of the transect. In fact, the book is a record of the work. It's not so much an inducement to start working this way. It's a record of the work that has collectively been done to pull together all the specialists who work on this. It pulls together the traffic engineers, it pulls together the environmentalists, it pulls together the developers of various building types, it pulls the retailers together. All of these people in suburbia are operating independently, and they're not working symbiotically. So the cities that we get, for example, the west of Miami, have all the elements of a city, but they're never assembled. Everything is separated because everybody's a specialist. And this blends everything. This is my friend John Torty doing it doing a transect analysis in other exotic cultures. This one's in India. And then there is the retrofit transect, in which you see the building types that occur in suburbia. This is a commercial center in suburbia. And then what happens when you don't code what's there. When you do a code for an area like this, you don't code what's there. you code what you want it to be. Okay, your planner works in the future. And so what happens is we find this place, and then we say, this is, without knocking anything down, I said, this is its future. And that's what you code. You don't code this, which is unfortunately what we're always doing. Oh, we want to improve this, but you keep the parking ratio, you keep the parking, you keep the frontages, you keep the, you don't do anything to it. It just replicates. They replace the dysfunctional building with a less dysfunctional building, but this actually envisions a much, it's an evolutionary future. It's successional. This city becomes more mature, more sophisticated. Okay, so that's it. It's really quick. Most of the essays are a really good read. They're fun, they're quite revealing. And this is the common language that we are more and more referring to. And I would say that architects have a part to play in the AIA, and you should know what's happening. Unfortunately, I can't tell you you'll be pioneering, that you're going to be avant-garde, because this book, as I said, is already a record of the work that's being done. And I've only shown you a very small selection. Now there are questions, I understand.
Let me see, Andres. Mostly everybody's just thanking you for your talk. I did have one question. What is the ideal block shape?
It depends on the, that's a very interesting question. It depends on the transect zone. For example, in this book, there's a plan of Nantucket, and you can tell what the transect zones are by the shape and size of the block. The blocks in downtown Nantucket, the city of Nantucket, are relatively rectangular, relatively small. And as you go out into the countryside, they become more and more irregular as they engage nature, and they become much larger, until finally the block size at the countryside are enormous tracts of land that are brought together. And this is like spying on something. You can actually, it's like looking at a microscope. You can actually look and understand perfectly what you're looking at through the lens of the transect. You can tell what the zoning is. You can tell everything. And it's a hell of a tool. It also gives the professional a great deal of credibility, because you explain the city to the local residents with a kind of precision that they're incapable of, but they will recognize that it's accurate and useful. So it's a way of credentializing your professionalism, instead of sort of saying, hey, the song and dance that most professionals have to put together. Do you like me personally? Do you trust me? No. No, excuse me. I know what I'm talking about. The way that so many people like doctors and scientists say, I know what I'm talking about. It puts many of what are considered aesthetic decisions into a completely technical context, which is actually the stock and trade of modern life. This is what they expect.
That's really interesting. I don't see any other questions, so you're off the hook.
Dang.
I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank all of you for tuning in, and buy the book.
Thank you.
It sounds fascinating. I want to get them for the center and start reading it. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of thank yous, and everyone enjoyed your talk. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye.
You too.